Maya had learned early and empirically that dignity did not always arrive courtesy of circumstance. It was a muscle she had to flex between shifts, between thinning paychecks, and the quiet demands of family that never quite understood how much was already given. Tonight, the muscle trembled. The stoop of her mother's building smelled of warm street air and something fried. The city's hum pressed at the ribs. Mama Ruth had called at noon to remind her, again, about the gathering, about the neighbors who still remembered names and marriages as if those were the only proof of a life worth respecting. Maya adjusted the box on her hip, felt the cardboard sag under the weight of banana pudding and a collar of foil-wrapped collard greens, and hoped the rest would hold. If you want to follow Maya's day of impossible choices and a moment that upends two carefully ordered lives, stay with this story. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support keeps more stories like this coming. The man who stopped to help had the kind of hands that suggested other things, firm, used to paper and glass, perhaps to the controlled slide of a pen signing things that became law in boardrooms. He was precisely dressed in navy and gray, a windbreak of cool that the subway gust could not ruffle. He crouched without hesitation and lifted the pudding box as if it weighed nothing. "Thank you," Maya said, embarrassed for being clumsy in front of someone who could afford better shoes than hers. Her cheeks were already hot. The jeans she could buy again. Pride was harder to replace. "It's nothing," he said. He examined the foil like it might disclose some scandal. "You okay?" She could have said yes and been gone, but the conversation that followed was unthinkably small and then suddenly vast. She told him, in the way people tell strangers the strangest things, because strangers sometimes carry away what families keep piling on like plates in a sink. "Maya's grandmother's 80 today," she said, then laughed at herself. 75. God, I can't count. The man smiled as if a small arithmetic error was forgiven. "We're having everybody over. Lorraine says I need to bring," she stabbed a finger at the lid of the box, "family." The man's eyes flicked to her hands, to the silver band on her finger. No, not a ring, just an old thumb guard. Then back to her face. The subway screeched as the car braked, and he straightened, clutching the box like something that must not be dropped again. For a moment, the city's sounds fell into the kind of private hush reserved for tabloids and confessions. "I don't have one," Maya said. The words were a pebble thrown into the water of her evening. Her throat was unexpectedly tight. Not a husband, not even someone who could pass. He looked at her for a long beat, measured, the way someone might measure a risk. "Would you?" she said, because asking the impossible was sometimes the only way to break the night's pressure. "Could you?" She hated the way her voice failed. "Could you be my husband for one day?" There was a laugh somewhere behind his mouth, but his face did not move with it. "That's not how things work. Please." The plea was not polished. The city had not taught her how to beg in well-formed sentences. She surprised herself with the rawness of it. She described Lorraine's assurances, Mama Ruth's insistence about appearances, how in a room of neighbors and cousins, singlehood read like failure. It sounded worse in the telling than it felt in the living, but that was the cruel geometry of expectations. From the outside, they were small. From inside, they were crushing. He stood for a moment, the puddle of refuge passengers flowing around them. He was Ethan Caldwell, she learned later, a name that would swell in the headlines, but tonight he was merely a stranger with a watch that cost more than her month's rent. She had no business asking him. He had no business saying yes. He said yes. Not because of some sudden swoon. He said yes because of the look on her face. Too tired to be performative, too real to be anything but honest. And because, for reasons he could not admit, he had been thinking about authenticity lately, about the hollow spectacles his mother favored, about the portraits that sat in his family's dining room like weathered reproaches. He had been invited to a board dinner that evening, a charcoal-suited, place-carded event where everything was arranged to please wealthy patrons. The idea of stepping back into another person's life for an afternoon felt less grotesque than the alternative, another evening of politely rehearsed grief. Saying yes carried a small, contained risk that, on calculation, felt bearable. "Rules," he said quickly, because he wanted borders. "No one asks questions you're not prepared to answer. I don't kiss you without consent. I don't lie about anything I can't keep in my pocket. I will not. You will not fall in love with me," Maya finished, half a joke and half a warning. He smiled, the professional kind that suggested negotiation. "I don't do unplanned complications." She believed him less than she had believed anything in years. But she thanked him properly, the way Mama Ruth had taught her, eyes level, a small nod, a gratefulness without apology, and tucked him into the geometry of the evening like an unlikely talisman. They exchanged phone numbers because the city requires logistics for miracles. The living room at Mama Ruth's was heat and noise, and a panoply of smells. The TV was off. A gospel station hummed from an old radio with more static than signal. Collard greens, rice, fried fish, a whole map of sustenance. Lorraine fussed over the arrangement of napkins like a general with mismatched troops. Cousins argued over whether the church raffle had remembered Mrs. Green. Mama Ruth sat in her armchair, the queen of the room, despite the softness of age, her hands folded like a secret. "You look tired, baby," Mama Ruth said when Maya slid into the chair beside her. Her eyes were bright, witty as scissors. "You brought too much," Lorraine announced, as if excess were the worst sin. "Who are you feedin', Maya? You tryin' to feed the block?" Maya shrugged. She kept her phone off most of the night. The pretense, the made-up husband, would begin in 10 minutes with a text message and a knock on the door. Ethan, by agreement, would be called Marcus, because Lorraine, conservative in her illusions, had an idea of names that sounded respectable. The knock came like a punctuation mark. Maya combed a hand through hair that had been pulled back into a practical bun and opened the door to a man with the impossible hands, the cool jacket, a face like a coin. He was a little more measured in proximity than when they'd met on the subway. He had read the room and worn the expression of a man who had prepared for a public role. He handed Maya a small bouquet he said a florist had recommended. It was peonies, discreet, expensive in a domesticated way. "Mrs. Williams," he said to Mama Ruth as if it were a ceremony. "Marcus Williams." Mama Ruth took his hand like a blessing and squeezed. "We're glad to meet you, son. Have you eaten?" The room tilted toward normalcy. Laughter smeared over the edges. Ethan, Marcus, had a way of owning the role without parody. He complimented the cooking, asked polite questions about church and work, and did not press for details. When Lorraine's eyebrows arched in the way that sought scandal, he steered the conversation to shared experiences of moving and settling and the challenges of community life. He kept gentle hands on the small grievances of the evening like a balm, as if he had learned that not every truth needed exposing. After the third course, when the night had thinned into stories and the cousins had begun their ritual competitive praise of Mama Ruth's recipes, Maya found a moment in the kitchen with him. The apartment hummed around them, plates clinked, laughter came in bursts. "You did well," she said, the words a salve and a complaint in the same breath. "You asked me to it," he replied. "I did not want to fail." She turned, heart echoing, "Why?" He paused as if measuring whether to keep the answer. "Because it seemed feasible. Because it made a difference in your night. He stopped, choosing a word that would not become too heavy. I'm not as practiced in," he gestured vaguely at the room, "this." "You looked like you belonged," Maya said. It was not flattery. It was relief. The room's judgments had been temporarily disarmed by a manufactured softness he carried so easily. He smiled, and for the first time that evening his face did not seem like a script. That was the goal. They parted into the night as if no claim had shifted. She had not expected anything more than an hour of relief. The city smelled of rain. Maya walked home with the lingering strain of a lie that had somehow settled into a truth-like shape. The next morning, reality arrived with a headline. Her phone, always off in other people's houses, buzzed with the kind of attention that swallowed afternoons. A local blog had run a piece on prominent philanthropist Ethan Caldwell seen at community gathering. The photograph might as well have been a bell. At noon, someone from a second-tier paper called asking whether Marcus Williams was an actual husband to Maya Williams. Lorraine called and demanded a name for the church gossip. Mama Ruth laughed and said they should not worry about what people printed. But the fact of attention introduced a vector of risk. Soon, what had been a private, negotiated charade began folding into the public sphere. Video clips of Ethan at the gathering made their way across feeds. An image of him holding a paper plate, a halo of ordinary humanity, stirred talk of authenticity in the philanthropic circles Ethan himself inhabited. His name, previously stable in economic certainty, now carried an anecdotal softness. At the foundation offices, a memorandum circulated that had the slickness of careful worry. Media attention was a variable, the memo said. Evelyn Caldwell read it with a practiced, narrow blink. Portraits, estate, legacy. She thought of them as a latticework of duty, preserving the house of Caldwell as one preserves an heirloom. It was not her nature to be sentimental. It was her nature to be strategic. Ethan, in his office that sat like a cold sun overlooking the city, watched the footage again. He kept his coffee black, drank it like a person refusing small kindnesses. The press attention would have been nothing more than a ripple if it had not been for an incoming call from the Foundation's communications director about donors noticing the photographic thread. Ethan, seen at a community meal, conjured speculation about his priorities. Evelyn called him later, voice like a damper. "We need to control the narrative," she told him. "Someone will see this as an opening." He wanted to say no, that his life had never been fully his to manage, that grief and memory and the sterile rooms of his house had a way of seeding rebellion in strange ways. He said instead that he helped a woman for one night. He did not tell the part that had lodged like a pebble in his throat over the look of Mama Ruth or the way the small cousins had listened when he asked about their futures. He would tell no one that he had felt, in the warmth of that kitchen, something ache not unlike belonging. For Maya, fallout arrived gentler. Comments at her part-time job, whispered questions from neighbors, and a cousin who joked too loudly about whether Marcus would be staying for the holidays. She received messages, some kind, many speculative, from strangers who had seen the photograph online. A woman wrote to say Mama Ruth's face had reminded her of her own grandmother. A man asked with sharpness whether it was staged. The attention was not uniformly bad, but it drew a line around her life like a rope, taut and visible. Then came the call from the local paper. "Are you available for a short interview about the event?" the reporter asked. The call felt like an interrogation dressed in curiosity. Maya said no, she did not want more attention. Then an email arrived from someone identifying themselves as a concerned member of the public, with an offer to pay for a story about authentic community voices. The message smelled of exploitation, and Maya discarded it. The situation might have stayed private if not for the Foundation's board meeting a week later. A rumor had already begun circulating within philanthropic circles. Ethan Caldwell, who usually moved through his days as if the world were divided into capital and not capital, had been seen in a way that suggested he was more accessible than the portraits implied. A board member, keen to protect the Foundation's tax-exempt status and public image, wondered aloud whether Ethan's attention to community affairs signaled a shift in funding priorities. The mentions in the financial press, the ones that talked about leverage and strategic reallocation, were clinical as a scalpel. When a national reporter called Maya asking for comment, she was prepared to say nothing. But then her phone rang with a number she recognized, Ethan Caldwell. He had only used his formal voice on the line. "We need to plan," he said. "They're asking questions about the event, about us, about whether this was—" He stumbled over the artifice of saying staged, as if one cannot say the word guiltless. "We need to control what's said," he added. "And we will need you to be careful." She told him she would be careful. She also told him that she would not be silenced. Between them, in the weeks that followed, developed an unlikely choreography. They began with rules. No photos without consent. No interviews without a plan. A rehearsal of backstory that could withstand scrutiny. They met in neutral places. A coffee shop on Lenox Avenue, where the espresso machine shrieked like a cat. A bench in a small park, patched with the scatter of late summer shade. Rehearsals, both literal and improvised, acquired a rhythm. Ethan learned to call her Mari when he wanted to provoke a laugh. Maya learned to adjust to his measured silences, to interpret them not as indifference, but as a calculus of everything he thought he owed. They scripted a marriage that contained only necessary facts. Where they met, where they worked. Ethan, finance; Maya, advocate. A wedding date that they could duck if pressed. A plausible story for how they supported one another. Maya watched from the audience of an event he had invited her to. She had agreed to be there because the Foundation had announced a listening dinner, a rhetoric-heavy phrase that meant people with power would pretend to be surprised by the needs he had already heard about. She felt exposed in a different way than at Mama Ruth's. At least at home, the stakes were familial. Here, stakes were capitalized. Evelyn eyed Maya with the thin curiosity of a woman checking the edges of a cloth before a vote. "You've been working with community initiatives?" she asked, in a tone that could be polite or suspicious. Maya answered with a clear, unshowy description of her work: case management for elders, organizing volunteer teams, running a small pantry. Her voice was steady because her experience lent it weight. She did not allow her humility to become apology. "When I was a girl," Mama Ruth had told her once, "you must not allow other people's yardsticks to measure you. You know your worth." The words came now as an antidote to Evelyn's quiet assessment. Maya spoke not as a petitioner, but as a participant. She had been drawn into an arena she did not choose, but she had a seat at the table she had earned by years of labor and care. After the meeting, as donors milled and finger food platters were passed like a ritual of cordiality, Ethan pulled Maya aside. "They'll ask for a name to put on a panel," he said. "They'll want somebody to be the face." She thought of Mama Ruth's stoop and the way neighbors said the truth in recipes and gossip. "Let them ask," she said. "They'll find out, one way or another." That night, Ethan dreamt of portraits. In his dream, the faces in the dining room warped into the people he had barely glimpsed at Mama Ruth's kitchen table. He woke with an ache he had not the words for. He was 38 and had learned to manage grief with a strictness he mistook for stoicism. Yet something about the soft honesty of those hours at the kitchen table had lodged under his sternum and refused to be ignored. A week passed. The foundation announced a listening tour, a gentle rebrand into terms vague enough to soothe donors. The Internet, gluttonous for rituals of redemption, spun takes of all hues. Some praised Ethan for connecting with real life. Others accused him of performative charity. Maya, who had not sought publicity, felt suddenly dragged into the light. And then came the claim. An attorney from the Caldwell Family Foundation landed in Maya's inbox like a stone. He was polite, his email calibrated to neutral. He asked for a meeting. The subject line read, "Clarification regarding misattributed marriage." Maya felt her throat close. The phrase misattributed marriage had the coldness of law. Even worse, the council wanted to know if she had any claim to the Caldwell name, to their fortune, to their influence. The implication was obvious, the kind of speculative question that invites both gossip and possibility. Someone in the family had decided to test the edges. She called Ethan with hands that trembled. He answered quickly, his voice low. "I'll come by," he said. "We'll handle this together." When he arrived, the apartment felt small. He wore a jacket with the interior pocket lined in blue silk. He sat on the sofa like someone who had stepped into a foreign field and was cataloging the ground. "They think," he began, but then stopped, the sentence collapsing under assumptions he refused to voice aloud. "They think we're conning them," Maya supplied. Her voice was brittle. "They think I'm trying to anchor into something not mine." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, the word surprising in its lack of cruelty. "Let them think many things. We will be clear." They arranged a plan that was part precaution, part strategic disobedience. Ethan would be forthcoming with his mother, Evelyn, about the charade in a way that did not invite scandal, but also did not allow appropriation. Maya would speak, if called, with a measured voice that could not be easily misconstrued. There would be no deception that invited exploitation. They chose honesty as a tactic, not a surrender. Evelyn received the news with a blend of irritation and appraisal. She had noticed in the last months the slippage that had started to affect her son's priorities. "You cannot simply bring people home, Ethan," she told him, at lunch in the Foundation's glass-walled dining room. Her voice was the sort that had kept fortunes intact. "There are expectations about our name. There are obligations." He listened, measured, for once not defending his choices as if they were private treasures. He admitted that he had been present at the community dinner. He did not pretend more. But he did something that startled her. He suggested that the Foundation put forward a small grant to support neighborhood-based initiatives, something that might be considered a pilot program. He proposed a listening council with community members represented, people with lived experience, not merely consultants. Evelyn's first instinct was to veto. Her world had rules that did not bend for goodwill alone. But she had been watching the press, too. A measured concession could be sold as strategic. She began to see the possibility of aligning legacy with relevance rather than preservation for its own sake. Her own arc moved not with sudden conversion, but with calculation, the kind that can endanger truths, but can also open a door. When the board convened to vote on the pilot grant, voices both subtle and sharp were raised. Some called the plan reckless. Donors, protective, feared mission drift. Others argued that philanthropy that did not adapt was pharaonic in its own decay. Maya sat in the audience again, this time with a clipboard and a name card. She watched the men and women in mid-century chairs move through a litany of risk. The vote was not unanimous. That, in itself, felt like a hard-won step. After the vote, a reporter cornered Maya and asked whether the Foundation's move meant that the Caldwell name was finally listening. She could have shrugged. Instead, she took the microphone and said plainly and without affect that listening must be followed by accountability. "We don't need charity disguised as spectacle," she said. "We need investment that looks like partnership." Her words, simple and clear, were recorded in more ways than one. They landed in the office of Elizabeth Camden, the Foundation's director, who had been observing from the wings. Elizabeth, who had the tight polish of an institutional operator, appreciated language that was both candid and useful. She invited Maya to join a preliminary advisory round, a collection of grassroots leaders and small-scale operators who would help set priorities for the pilot. That development, official recognition in the Foundation's process, moved the situation from the realm of personal charade into institutional possibility. For Maya, it was vindication. For Ethan, it was a strange relief. The arrangement that had begun as a ruse had opened a door that could be pushed by honest voices. Not everyone was pleased. Rumors circulated that the Foundation's board felt manipulated by a spectacle. A faction lobbied for legal clarity, suggesting that the Caldwell estate could be liable if donors were misled. An email thread leaked to a columnist, and a blog post framed Maya as either a muse or a manipulator, with readers free to decide. The city's appetite for drama is never sated. In private, the closeness between them deepened in ways neither had predicted. It did not happen in a whirl of cinematic revelation, but in small domestic things. Ethan learning how to fold a fitted sheet because Maya taught him, his clumsy hands fumbling and then getting it right. Maya finding a coffee mug in his desk drawer with a lipstick stain she had not left there, which made her laugh because it meant someone else had been there before the charade. A call he took at 2 a.m. from a donor, and after he hung up, he admitted to her he had thought of his late wife and how different grief looks on paper than in public.
One rain-soaked evening, they sat on the stoop of a brownstone that could, with repair and mess and commitment, be real living space. The stoop was a threshold, a literal and figurative place where the world outside meets the private. It symbolized the thinness between the lives they had been performing and the lives they might choose. "Do you ever think about what you wanted before any of this?" Maya asked, voice small. Ethan stared at the street. "I wanted," he said slowly, "a life that had texture, a house that felt alive, not portraits that stare." Maya laughed, a short sound that carried both rue and joy. "We're odd company, you with your quotas of texture and me with my catalog of chores." They joked, and the joke was honest.
A small plaque hung on the wall of the community center, a modest recognition of the program's first year, put there by people who preferred building to speeches. Maya looked at the way the light caught the rim of her wedding band and thought of the question she had asked on a subway platform with banana pudding as sacrament. The absurdity of it made her laugh, and the sound was not shame but delight. The lie that had been a stitch to save a night had become something different, a bridge to accountability, to partnership, and to a home that was rebuilt not by the wealthy alone, but with those who had always been doing the work. If the story had a single moral, it was this: a small act of audacity, when paired with honesty and an insistence on dignity, can shift even the most entrenched systems. It matters who gets to speak at the table and who is asked to the microphone. It matters that people find ways to listen without assuming charity is the only currency of care. The city carries on in its way, indifferent and relentless, but sometimes it yields places where people can make durable things. Maya's life did not become a parable of sudden redemption. It became a ledger of choices, some selfish, some generous, that together produced an outcome neither she nor Ethan could have scripted in their first hurried conversation. They had asked for a favor and for a day, and they received instead a future that required work, truth, and the kind of courage that insists on being seen. They hosted roast chicken at the brownstone the next year for Mama Ruth's 81st birthday. The foundation donated a modest sum to refurbish the community center's aging heating system. Evelyn attended, present and distractedly proud, her fingers folded around a cup of tea. Lorraine wore a dress she had loved for decades and, with a laugh, danced with a neighbor. Across the room, Maya and Ethan stood for a moment, hands touching the small of each other's backs in practiced tenderness. Outside, the stoop was an altar to ordinary lives. Letters arrived at the brownstone from people who learned the foundation's new grant process and were grateful. A teen wrote about a job gained through a small stipend. A woman wrote to say her pantry had been repaired. These were the measures that mattered. On the final page of their shared year, Ethan drove Maya to a small site where the foundation would seed the building of a modest community workshop. The ground was muddy. The board had voted with caveats. Workers in yellow vests navigated the site with steady competence. The work would be slow. There would be inspections and more votes and compromises. That was how change held. Uneven, sometimes maddeningly bureaucratic, but real. Maya stepped into the mud and laughed, the sound bright as a bell. She thought, briefly, of the subway, the banana pudding, the impossible plea she had made to a stranger. That simple question, "Can you be my husband for just one day?"
No, had changed everything. Not because the lie itself was virtuous, but because it forced honest reckoning into rooms that had been otherwise closed. It made clear what dignity looked like when people were allowed to take it for themselves. They turned back toward the city, while the sun pushed through clouds and lit the cranes in distant orange. There was work to do. The center's plumbing had to be fixed, grants had to be administered, and a community needed to be listened to. They would do it not as a charity performance, but as co-workers in a small revolution that began with speech and required the sturdier materials of accountability. If anyone asked again whether they had been married all along, Maya could now answer with integrity. They had been, in a way, married to the work and each other, married to a future they would help build. And if that sounded like a longer, truer kind of vow, it was because it was. Winter came, and with it a thin, shining patience. The cranes kept their slow choreography against the low sky. And the workshop rose in stages, a concrete slab, then a skeleton of beams that caught the wind like a harp. There were days the site looked more like a promise than a place. Puddles that reflected rigging, tarps tied down against gusts. But each morning someone arrived with boots and a plan. Lorraine learned to read blueprints with a stubborn pleasure. Mama Ruth boiled a pot of coffee for the crew and dispensed orders with the economy of someone who had seen too many things break to be sentimental about them. Evelyn came sometimes, hands folded, sitting at the edge of meetings as if she were both spectator and judge. She listened more than she spoke. There were setbacks that reminded everyone why change had to be built with elbows and patience. An inspection failed because an electrician had cut a corner. A grant came with a clause that required a fiscal sponsor the community could not produce. A storm in late October flooded the basement with a foul-smelling muck that would not be donated away. On the morning they opened the door to assess the damage, Maya found Ethan standing in the dim, holding a mop like a general. He had bags under his eyes, a foundation report flapped under his arm, but when he saw her, his face made room for something like rest. "We can hire the cleanup crew," he said, "or we can borrow the van and do it ourselves. I know which one I want." They borrowed vans and rallied people. Neighbors who had once been shy about meetings brought gloves and pull straps. The teen who had been offered the stipend that led to a job, now working the afternoons at a hardware co-op, came first, sleeves rolled, telling older men where to stand and what to drag. A woman whose pantry had been repaired by the summer program arrived with a cart of cleaning supplies and a thermos. She moved through the space with the ease of someone who had been given back something practical and kept it.
It not was heroic so much as ordinary, people showing up because they had been asked and because the work belonged to them. At the board meeting that followed, the Foundation's caveats became headlines in a small, quiet way. Some board members still preferred neat boxes on paper rather than messes that smelled like wet mud. There were questions about scalability, metrics, risk. Ethan spoke as if the room were a household he had to persuade to care for a child. He did not plead with the language of pity. He framed the numbers, the letters from the people who had received help, the steady uptick in applications for small stipends from locals who had previously been ignored. He angled for compromise, more oversight, yes, but with the stipulation that oversight would learn to listen. "What's the point," he said, in a moment that made the air thin, "if the people closest to the problem are never the ones invited to solve it?" It was not a speech that converted cynics outright, but it loosened fingers. A vote was taken with caveat again, but the vote was enough.
The plumbing was replaced, the grant reissued with a pilot plan. The inspector stamped a stamp that smelled faintly of bureaucracy and possibility. The day of the ribbon cutting was warm and impossible for late November. The workshop smelled of sawdust and paint, the air thick with the kind of chatter that keeps large spaces warm. A hand-painted sign hung above the door bearing a name the community chose together, the Brownstone Collective, with the letters wobbly in a child's good scissor enthusiasm. Mama Ruth stood by the doorway, ribbon in hand, as solid and unexpected as a judge's gavel. Lorraine had a smudge of paint on her cheek. Evelyn wore a coat she had never once been seen in at the center previously, and when she laughed, it sounded like a forgiveness. They made space for small rituals. A teen who had been apprenticed to a carpenter announced the first scheduled class, a weekend series in table making. A woman whose pantry had been repaired offered a monthly cooking night. Maya thought of the absurdity of the subway question and the single day that began the whole thread. She stood at the back, ring catching sunlight like a punctuation, and watched the places where people who had once been served become the ones who served. There was music. Someone had brought a battered radio tuned to a station that played old soul. And there was food, because of course there was. Banana pudding, made by Mama Ruth in the same pot she used for every neighborhood feast, arrived as if by law. Someone pressed a paper plate into Maya's hand, and when she sat down at a folding table, Ethan sat too. They did not need to stage tenderness. They had practiced it in small, honest gestures, showing up for meetings, returning calls, writing checks when asked, admitting mistakes. They ate with the kind of ease that belongs to people who had borne small embarrassments and kept choosing one another.
Letters kept arriving in the months that followed, not always eloquent, but always precise. A note from a woman who had found work because a grant had provided childcare. A postcard from a boy who learned to solder and used that skill in a summer job. A letter from a teacher asking if the workshop could host a program to repair students' bikes. The ledger of small things grew weighty. It was, in its way, a testament. Evelyn and Maya developed a language of civility that did not require promises. At times, Evelyn's posture relaxed. At other moments, she remained watchful, an older woman, not commanded into intimacy by gestures. They had their moments, conversations that felt like sanding down rough feelings until they were more manageable. And in one small evening, Evelyn brought a photograph of her younger self holding an infant. "I thought I was the only one," she said, voice thin. "I thought my hands could do it all, and then I learned what I could not." She did not ask for absolution, and received none, only the quiet of another person hearing. In the end, the change that had begun with an improbable question was not a tidy moral. The foundation adjusted its application process so that it was less an exam and more a conversation. They created a small advisory board, largely made up of people who had used the center. The Brownstone Collective's first classes held a waiting list. There were days of fatigue and arguments about priorities, about who would get the first 3-month fellowship, about whether a tool library should loan power saws. And there were clear reconciliations when someone forgave another for a slide remark, and someone else admitted they had been wrong. Maya thought often of dignity, how it was not merely the giving of things, but the confidence to receive them without shame, the authority to set the terms of one's own help.
She understood now that audacity could open doors, but could not make the work that followed be easy. That work required listening, patience, and the humility to accept that any single person's good intent would never substitute for the knowledge of those who lived the consequences. On an evening when the city held its breath between rainstorms, the workshop hummed with the low mechanical glory of tools and people. A woman who had learned welding bent a metal arm into a lamp. A boy soldered circuits for a school science project. An old man taught a child to plane wood. Maya and Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the light settle on sawdust and fingers. She reached for his hand, and he turned to her with a look that bore both mischief and the quiet of mutual labor. "Can you be my husband for one more day?" she asked, half teasing, the joke now a ritual and a history. He laughed, soft and whole, and answered in the only honest way he could. "I already have been." They stood there for a long moment, two people who had learned to build something larger than themselves.